If your best friend had a cat who she dearly loved but recently passed away, and she came to you asking if you could make a holder to honor his memory, what would you do? I said, "Yeah, of course I will." And I assured her that I would make the best forever home for him. As important as this project is, I actually had a very small window of time to get it done because in less than a week, I'll be going out of town with Don's family. Because of that, I needed every move and every second to count and spent a lot of time thinking through every nook and cranny of this build. I went very in depth with my 3D modeling and made sure that there wasn't any room to wing anything, and because of that, I felt really good going into this build. For the overall frame and structure, I decided to go with white oak to give it some warmth without looking too heavy. And for the Kumiko portions and grids, I decided on maple to create a slight contrast against the frame, allowing the detail work to shine in a subtle and not too obnoxious way. With the birdhouse I just finished, I used the Festool table saw pretty extensively and really enjoyed how it handled all the small pieces. So for this project, since it features way more tiny and intricate pieces, I decided to go with the Festool again for a majority of the cuts. I first started working on the frame, and once all the pieces were cut, I decided to create chamfers on the ends. This was one of those steps that I didn't plan to do at first, which is a little ironic after all the talk I just did about planning every move out. But you know what? Sometimes good ideas happen when you least expect it, and for the sake of art and awesomeness, I think it's completely okay to stay flexible and ready for them. Adding chamfers here, in my opinion, will give the piece a nice, gentle, and decorative touch, taking away from the bulkiness and giving it an extra pinch of elegance. Now, as you can see, I have now moved over to my saw stop, and that's because I needed a blade with flat teeth to make some dado cuts. I actually don't know if there are any blades with flat teeth available for Festool saw, but it is a feeling of luxury to be able to switch back and forth between the two saws for specific purposes. Throughout this project, I also put a big emphasis on taking my time on cut preparation. Things like getting the blade height perfect, making sure I had the pieces placed perfectly, and double and sometimes triple checking everything. This is because I wanted to make all my joints really tight. Normally, I'd consider myself a little clumsy with my cuts and usually end up with a little wiggle room here and there, but for these, all the extra time and patience I put into making sure everything was perfect created freaking amazing results. The joints I got were so tight that I already knew they would hold together by joint friction alone, meaning zero glue. I don't know if you can tell by how I'm talking right now, but I am very proud of how my cuts turned out. After finishing the hashtag shapes, I continued to make the dado cuts for the vertical parts of the frame. Once I got all those crazy cuts done, I assembled the pieces to see how everything was fitting together, and whoa, was it a special feeling. I think this was the first time I'd ever worked on a piece and could visibly see a rough final shape on the very first day of working. It usually takes me at least a few days of hard work, and this isn't to say that it sucks to wait a while. I think it was the fact that I had the pressure of time looming over my shoulders, and seeing the piece starting to come together gave me some hope. Because low-key, there's a part of me that's a bit nervous about the possibility of needing to pull a couple of all-nighters in a row to get this done on time. Combine that anxiety with the sentimental meaning of this project, along with it being my very first time experiencing this kind of speed of gratification, and that is the magical potion that struck me today. For, I guess, the floor of the case, I'm gonna be putting in plywood with white oak veneer on the underside. I decided to go with this route because with plywood, I won't have to worry about any potential wood movement. I then moved over to start making rabbet cuts on the bottom frame, and despite me originally wanting to use my table router instead of the makeshift plywood surface that you see me using here, this is probably the 8th time that I've again realized that I don't have a 1/4 inch collet for it. Every time I've run into this, I've made reminders to myself to purchase a collet, but for some reason, I keep forgetting anyways, and have ended up needing to do it this way again. Ugh. Nine's times a charm, I guess. After getting most of the rabbit cuts done on the router table, I hand chiseled the remaining bits on the corners to get everything squared. And with the bottom hashtag ready to go, it was time to set the bottom floor I made earlier into it. Now, if you noticed earlier, the style of veneer that I used was a peel and stick kind, and these make the job really easy. The adhesive does add a little bit of thickness, but that isn't a problem at all because the overall job gets done super fast and clean. After a little test fitting, I gave the veneer side a light sanding since it'll be harder to reach later on, and last but not least, glued the piece in. Making the door is the very next step, and when I was doing research for this project, I think the thing I spent the most time looking at were door hinges. Since this project is basically a baby scale project, there were significantly fewer options for hinges as compared to mid scale or large projects like cabinets or chests. When I was browsing through hinges on jewelry box designs, nothing caught my eye. Everything was either an H hinge or a piano hinge, and I wanted to use a hinge that was more invisible. The goal here is to put the attention towards the center at either the Kumiko work or the urn. If it was able to draw your eyes away from it, it was a distraction. And eventually, I got the idea of using a pivot hinge. I found some brass ones on Amazon that were small enough to where they wouldn't disturb the rest of the design. So I bought them and planned the door design to incorporate those specific hinge widths. It's so funny because now that I'm looking back at this footage, I actually figured out an answer to something I was stuck on when I did my original planning. On the frame, you can see that the maple grids are sitting lower than the dado cuts. And that's because I'm gonna be putting in a piece of plexiglass that will sit on top of the grid system. When I was designing it, I couldn't figure out a way to not have the dados left with that space. I was stuck on the idea of needing to use through half-lap joints, but now, after taking a step back, I realized that an easy fix would have been to make a hidden half-lap joint instead. It isn't a big deal because the end result still looks great, but I guess this is yet another testament to the idea of how answers can come once you step away from the problem. So right now, I am in the process of making strips for the Kumiko work that'll be on the other 3 walls and the top. This was quite the process, and normally I'd sit down and calculate how many I need, but for this madness, I just went with the mindset of the more, the better. This is also in part because it'll be the first time I'll be doing a Kumiko design, which, for those of you who don't know, is a traditional Japanese woodworking technique where you assemble lots of intricate, geometric, and interlocking wood patterns without the use of nails or glue. Now, I won't be using any nails, but I will be using glue to keep everything in place because I kind of think of it like a puzzle that I want to keep together. I'm confident it'll stay together, but only in the case that I was the only one to ever handle it. This is gonna go through international shipping and possibly even change the locations over the next few decades. So, I ain't taking that risk. With all of the pieces cut to size, I moved back to work on the door to get the pivot hinge in. Now usually, hinges are something I don't work on until near the end of a build, but in order to achieve the look I wanted, I needed to do it now. When I think of the concept of hardware utilization, I typically associate it with the idea of having parts that are removable or replaceable. And in this case, we're talking about the door and the specific hinges I picked for it. If I was to go the route of making the door a removable piece, I would have needed to have an uneven gap between the top and the bottom of the door frame, similar to the construction and installation of sliding doors. And while there are some obvious benefits to having a removable door, I just couldn't bear the idea of having an uneven gap. So, for the sake of the art and visual awesomeness yet again, I decided to make the installation of this door a permanent one. That, and of course, I'm pretty sure this urn holder isn't going to be something that's played around with very often anyways. I traced the outline of the hinge and used the Shaper Trace app to take a picture, which turned into a vector file for the origin to route out. And when I say that this thing still blows my mind. I mean it. It's crazy to see how much woodworking equipment has improved since I started woodworking, which has only been a total of 8 years. I mean, at this rate, I feel like there'll come a day where you just download information into your brain and then be able to literally do anything. Well, that might be a little too extreme. But for now, I'm just happy with the fact that with a few clicks, I was able to perfectly route out the space I needed. Of course, after all the work I'd done so far, I had to give the whole thing a dry assembly to see how things were coming together. It did take a little finagling to get it all lined up, but here is the result. I am right now officially starting the Kumiko portion of the project. I was nervous and excited at the same time because on one hand, I am walking into unknown territory, and on the other hand, I'm making damn good time on this project. I guess this sensation is a combination of a self pat on the back mixed with a little bit of bring it on and healthy dose of hope. The strips I'm cutting at the moment are all for the grids, which are essentially going to be the frames that the intricate smaller pieces will fit inside. Once they were ready, I glued up the grid that will go on the top of the holder first. This was because it was the smallest and quickest one to put together, and because I will be using it as a reference to create all the tiny pieces. Now I do already have all the exact measurements I need to cut out the little pieces, but even so, I wanted to make sure I accounted for all the tiny human errors I might have made. And with work as intricate as this, I really cannot solely rely on the measurements I wrote, or at least that's how I feel. It could be that I'm just being overly careful, but you know what? It's better to be safe than sorry. Now, over the next very long time, you will essentially be seeing me put together the grids and cut a bajillion pieces. And while I do this, I was gonna go ahead and tell you a little bit about the Kumiko design I'm making. The pattern I'm making is called kakuaza, a design that's abstractly inspired by the hemp leaf. When I first heard that it was inspired by a hemp leaf, I was kind of surprised at the idea that they modeled the Kumiko design after a marijuana plant. But after a little bit of research, it turns out that in Japan, the hemp leaf was highly valued for its strength, fast growth, and usefulness in making textiles, ropes, and other goods. Because of that, the hemp leaf became associated with strength, growth, and resilience, and the symmetrical star-shaped pattern became more of an abstract representation to the pointy, elongated, and symmetrical nature of the leaves. To make this kakuaza pattern, it starts with a square that is divided into 4 equal squares. Each one of these will then have a diagonal piece to divide the small squares into triangles. From there, 2 additional lines extend from the main middle point directly in between the first diagonal line, as well as from the opposite corners. Where these newly extended lines meet is where the last little shorty line extends to meet the remaining corners. The first diagonal piece has 90-degree arrow ends, so it'll need 2 45-degree cuts on both ends. The mirroring pieces have one arrow end that is 45 degrees, but it needs one 64-degree cut and one 71-degree cut. The other end is 86 degrees. The shorty piece has one arrow end that is 90 degrees, and the other arrow end is 60 degrees, which needs 60-degree cuts. It, of course, sounds like a lot. And when I originally put everything into numbers, it was a pretty intense feeling. 28 long pieces, 56 shorty pieces, and 112 mirroring pieces. And yes, don't forget to think about all the angle cuts I'll need to make for each one of them. You can see why I was a little nervous about completing this project on time now, right? As I moshed through this crazy uphill grind, the mantra I repeated in my head was one step at a time. And at the end of the day, surprisingly, I was able to cut out all the Kumiko pieces I needed. And being that I made it out alive, I do believe that a happy floppy chicken dance is in order. As glorious as that little celebratory dance was, I wasn't in the clear yet because I still had to cut all the angles, which is the harder task, by the way. The strategy I had in mind was to cut what I could on the table saw first, and out of the different 5 angles I had to cut, the only 2 I could cut safely with the table saw were the 45 and 86-degree angles. I utilized 3 techniques to make the cuts. The first one of which was by clamping sacrificial plywood boards to my miter gauge. Doing this lets me create zero clearance surfaces on both the bottom board and fence, making sure the angles I cut have no room to fall through. And since the pieces were so tiny, I obviously wasn't going to be able to use my hand to hold it. So for technique number 2, I used the eraser side of a pencil as my grip instead, which, in my opinion, works so well for smaller pieces. Last but not least, which, now that I'm thinking of it, may not count as a technique per se, was my organization. I put some masking tape on a stick with the sticky side up and made sure to label and organize each angle and piece into columns. As you can see, I put a lot of effort into keeping things neat, and while I am typically pretty organized with my work, I learned from my recent birdhouse project that being even more organized will only pay off in speed and workflow, especially since I was working with angles that were so similar. And now I am cleaning up a maple board to make jigs for cutting the rest of the angles because they wouldn't really be too safe to cut on the table saw. To make the jigs, I'm basically cutting the block with the angle I need and then making a dado cut so that the small pieces can sit inside it. Then, with either a hand planer or chisel, cutting at the angle I need. This technique is definitely nothing new. Jigs for cutting angles is a common practice in Kumiko making. I think it's just a matter of how fancy you decide to make it, because I have seen people make some really nice ones. When I initially made the angle cut on the saw stop, I wasn't really satisfied with the quality of the cut. It left some blade marks, and because of that, didn't turn out as flat as I wanted it to be. This is a problem I've been experiencing with this table saw, so instead I went ahead and redid the angle cut on the festival table saw, and the result came out perfect. I even put on a ruler edge on the surface to check how clean the cut was, and not a single ray of light was able to squeeze between them. And on another note, I do love SawStop brand, especially for their safety mechanism. But if I knew ahead of time that their contractor table saw didn't have a way to adjust the blade alignment, I probably would have just gone for the professional model instead. At this point, the jigs were ready and I began to chisel out all the angles. But before I really started getting into the flow of things, there were 2 events that also happened. Number 1, I'd poke my finger with the chisel. And number 2, I briefly tried using a hand planer to do the job. During my research phase, I spent some time watching a few process videos of professional Kumiko makers, and I thought I remembered seeing someone using a hand planer for the angles. So when I got to this part, I thought, you know what? I'm gonna try it too. Gotta do what the pros do, right? But as soon as I attempted to use a hand planer, I went, nah, not using this. Controlling the hand planer for such an intricate and precise job wasn't something I felt very confident about. I honestly felt like I was gonna shave the jig along with the piece. And after all that preparation work, I was not gonna risk it all based on something I thought professionals would do. I grabbed a chisel instead, and even with it, I still found it pretty difficult to get comfortable with. I was constantly moving around the jig to try and find that right spot, and in the process of doing so, I nicked my finger. Well, luckily the nick wasn't too bad, but I did need to get a band-aid for it. And after getting through about 10 more pieces, I finally figured out. After getting my flow dialed in, all I had to do was rinse and repeat. The smarter strategy might have been to first get a bunch of pieces done and then put them all together, but instead, immediately after chiseling out a piece, I just went ahead and put it into the frame because I think I wanted to make sure that everything was coming out okay and had a snug fit. Additionally, doing this also gave me a consistent hit of instant gratification, so that was cool too. All the pieces were turning out great, and after getting enough cut out for the top frame, I decided to go ahead and glue it all together. And just like that, my first Kumiko pattern ever was complete. I know that right now I might sound all excited about it, but my actual reaction in the moment was more like, that's it? I think all that anticipation and energy going into focus kind of warped my perspective a little. But after a day or two, I did come to really appreciate what I made. From there, all I did was repeat, 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 with a big additional pinch of confidence. And at the end, I got a surprise present of some really sore hands. I'd hand chiseled a total of 336 sides, a long process that was tough, but rewarding in how I got to really submerge myself into the action and forget about everything else. I guess you can call it a meditative state. And the result of that was this. And now it's time to clean them up a little. I sanded the hashtag frames, chiseled out all the little glue squeeze outs I could find, and oh, Kumiko purists, I advise you to look away and plug your ears for like 10 seconds. I sanded the Kumiko panels. After getting everything nice and smooth, I moved on to installing the hinges with these brass screws. I pre-drilled a hole, and while carefully screwing in the very first screw, found myself saying, son of a bitch! I honestly think that every time I've ever used brass screws, they have always found a way to fail me at least once. They look very pretty, which is why I get them. But damn, it's frustrating. After I increased the drill bit size, the rest went in just fine. And if you're wondering what I ended up doing with the broken screw, I just left it in there. I'm considering it a little Easter egg for those of you who are watching this entire video. I have always thought that cutting plexiglass was one of the dirtiest and stinkiest materials to cut on a table saw. All the little particles that fly out loves to cling to everything, and because of all that static, those wannabe silly string pieces become even more stubborn and will not brush off easily. Plexiglass is also lighter than wood, so whenever I try to handle them the same way, like with a push paddle, I find that they tend to rattle. And to prevent the rattling, I usually have to get my hand positioned closer to the blade. The smell is another thing. I remember when I used to supervise at my school woodshop, every time plexiglass was being cut, I would always brace myself for that horrible plasticky stench. I did the same thing with the plexiglass here, but thankfully, the smell with this wasn't so bad. This little device I'm using is a chamfer hand planer that I got years ago from Japan. About 3 years after I'd gotten into woodworking, I took a trip to Kyoto with a friend. Needless to say, the idea of visiting a woodworking store in Japan was super exciting. With the very little Japanese that I could speak, I visited a tool store and fumbled my way through conversations with the staff to find and purchase some tools. Like this one. With it, I knocked out the sharp edges that your hands would have direct contact with, and throughout the process, found myself really enjoying the hand planer because of its simplicity and low risk on messing any other parts up. After dry assembling the urn again to try and put all the Kumiko panels in, I found that it needed some light sanding on one or two edges, but after those slight adjustments, everything fit in perfectly. I decided to dry assemble everything again, and although I usually use clamps to do this on projects, I found it made everything kind of awkward and difficult to handle. So when I was about to dry assemble it again here, I randomly got this idea to try some rubber bands, and they worked so well. Definitely something I'll remember to do on smaller projects in the future. People always say that a well-sharpened hand planer is able to cut wood fibers so cleanly, leaving a surface that is so exceptionally smooth that you won't need any finishing. And that's also one of the reasons why Kumiko also doesn't need finishing. But in my case, since I'm kind of already breaking some of those traditional rules, I thought, I might as well apply some finishing on this too. You know, to protect it from stains and stuff. Now, even though I knew I wanted to give it some finishing, I also wanted to create two different tones for a subtle pop of contrast. For the exterior frame, I'll be using an oil-based finishing to bring out that rich and warm colors of the white oak, and for the inner Kumiko parts, I'll be using a spray lacquer to keep it as close to its beautiful original maple color as possible. I first worked on the maple and gave it multiple coats outside. And in between my spray sessions, I went back inside to work on the urn stand. This stand is what's gonna be holding the urn in place, preventing it from sliding everywhere like an air hockey puck. On a piece of plywood I cut out, I used Shaper Origin to cut out a circle that also, by the way, accounts for some foam tape that I'll be using to give the urn a nice and snug fit. And look, how perfect is this? And speaking of perfect, during one of my coats of finishing outside, I happened to get out there at the perfect time to spot one of the biggest grasshoppers I'd ever seen. Sitting at just a little longer than 3 inches, that grasshopper was so big, that kind of freaked me out. And then it hopped away. But moving back to the urn stand, I am now working on dazzling it up a bit by adding some white oak veneer. Instead of simply slapping on a piece like the one I did earlier, I decided to get a little fancy with this one and made a pattern. I figured that since this was going to be on the face side, sprucing it up a little bit would be a really nice and subtle touch to the overall feel. Once the veneer had some time to get comfortable in their new home, I poked through the center of the hole and trimmed it off with a flush trim router. The second thing I'm doing to dazzle this up is edge banding. Both of these processes were not part of my original plan, but while working on the project, I was feeling like my overall pacing was fantastic. So when the idea for adding these features popped up, I knew I had the time and space to do it. So I went for it. And I'm really proud of myself for doing so. It's one of those things where you know you didn't have to, but you also know that you would not have been satisfied if you ignored it. So I've gotta ask, do you know who the Benjamin Button of the woodworking world is? It's none other than Steve Ramsey, one of the OG YouTube woodworkers, and somehow, at least from what I've seen on camera, he seems to literally be getting younger with time. And besides the fact that I'd be interested in hearing how his routine differs from Brian Johnson's, I learned a very useful technique from one of Steve's videos a long time ago. And that is by buffing lacquered surfaces with some crinkled up brown paper. In his video, he noted that doing so leaves a really soft and smooth feeling surface, and when I first tried it out, I found this to be very true. I don't use spray lacquer that often, but every time I do, I will always make sure to do this step. Now that the edge banding has settled in, I jumped back over to the glass stand to finish it up. I cut the excess off and then, yes, I am now cutting out a notch from the beautiful edge banding I just made. The thing that I'd forgotten to account for when I made this stand was a corner where the door swings open and close. It was one of those things where I just got so in the zone and excited to do something that I ended up missing a detail. It was heartbreaking to have to cut through it, but on the positive side, even though the plywood layer will be exposed, that notch really won't be easy to see because the door will still be covering it up. After sticking in the foam and drilling some holes for the magnets, I moved on to what will be the final few steps of the project. Starting with, give me a drum roll here. Glue ups. I started off by gluing the magnets into the holes with 2-part epoxy glue. I've used magnets in a couple different projects in the past and they have always worked wonderfully. With the glue I had remaining, I applied a very thin line of it along the rabbet cuts before placing the plexiglass in it. As you can see, these 2-pound blocks from Don's weight training vests have become quite handy in my woodshop these days. And with a combination of both sea glue and wood glue, I glued together the rest of the stand. Usually, my stress levels spike during glue ups, but throughout the process of making this stand, I have assembled and disassembled the stand so many times that I become pretty comfortable with every corner and angle of this piece and was basically fearless for this one. Everything seemed to go in pretty smoothly. The rubber bands continued their MVP status, and the only thing that almost stressed me out were the plexiglass panels. Because of the angle that I was trying to slide them in at, and because of the super perfect fit I gave them, they had a difficult time clearing the edge at the top. When I was pushing at it, I kept getting worried that I would potentially crack them because of the amount of pressure I was putting on them. The more my stress rose, the more I began to sweat, and boy was I sweating my butt off. At that point, Dawn offered to give it a shot and was very easily, I might add, able to get two of them in like it was nothing. Sometimes a different perspective can go a long way, and I was very thankful for that. The very last thing I decided to add though were some dowels. Because while all the wall panels had a perfect fit, the top panel actually became ever so slightly loose. It wasn't bad, but enough to where if someone were to be a little rough and push at the top panel, I felt like it could fall in, and dowels are my answer to that. After getting the dowel situated, I taped up the Kumiko panels to prepare it for the last bit of finishing that I was gonna do. I even made a little tab to open the door with. Isn't it cute? And finally, the finishing. For the entirety of this exterior frame, I will be using Rubio Monocoat Natural. I like it because of how it deepens the white oak color without bringing too much of this yellow hue that some oil finishes tend to elicit. And if you remember, the reason why I wanted to use finishing on this project is both for lasting protection and to create some contrast. But you know how you get those moments where one thing is just a little bit unimportantly off and bugs you? Like when you want an even number on the gas pump and you get something like 20.01 at the last squeeze. It doesn't really matter, but it's just like a dang it. If you really paid attention to this video, I actually had one of those moments with all of the finishing. So, I have an oil type finishing for the outer frames, right? And on the Kumiko parts, I used lacquer. The thing is, the frames directly around the Kumiko cuts are, well, also white oak. And since I sprayed all of those panels with lacquer, I technically lost the opportunity to bring out those rich warms on them. Or, in another perspective, lost the opportunity to have all of them as maple. At the end of the day, it really didn't matter much because it still looks amazing and wasn't going to affect the look very much. It's just that little whisper in the back of my mind that every now and then goes, dang it. And then, whatever. And after making the very last move of taking off all the covers I put on the Kumiko panels, you know what I'm gonna say. Voila.